5.2 Parallelograms in Unit 5, Polygons. A parallelogram is a quadrilateral or a four-sided polygon with both pairs of opposite sides that are parallel. Remember that parallel means the two sides would never intersect. The term parallelogram, PQRS, can be written with a little parallelogram symbol in front of it to represent parallelogram. In parallelogram PQRS to the right, the side PQ is parallel to RS. And you can see that with these arrows or these triangles drawn on the two sides. The double bars, remember, mean parallel. And QR is parallel to PS. Notice there are two triangles on each of these sides, representing QR and PS are different direction than QP and RS. This lesson will be looking at the properties of parallelograms. The first being that opposite sides are parallel. If a quadrilateral is a parallelogram, then its opposite sides are congruent, meaning the same length. So in PQRS, PQ is the same length as RS, and QR is the same length as PS. Likewise, opposite angles are also congruent in a parallelogram. So Q is congruent to S, and P is congruent to R. Let's take a little look. If we want to find the values of X and Y, we can use the fact that the opposite sides and opposite angles are congruent to do this. ABCD is a parallelogram by the definition. Use theorem 8.3 to find the value of X. AB has to be congruent to DC. Therefore, we can set AB equal to DC. So X plus 4 has to equal 12. Subtract 4 from each side, and you're going to get X is equal to 8. If we plug 8 back in, we would get 8 plus 4 is 12, matching DC on its opposite side. How about Y? Well, in a parallelogram, opposite angles are congruent to each other. Therefore, Y has to be the same as 65. So X is 8 and Y is 65. Let's do that one more time. Find the values of D and Z. Let's start by trying to solve for Z. Z is this right side over here. The short side of the parallelogram has to be congruent to this short side, or I should say opposite sides have to be congruent to each other. Therefore, we can set Z minus 8 equal to 20. Add 8, and Z is 28. Let's solve for D. In a parallelogram, opposite angles are congruent. Therefore, D minus 21 has to be 105. Add 21 to both sides, and D has to be 125. Another property of a parallelogram is that your consecutive angles will be supplementary. If you remember back to when you are looking at two parallel lines and those parallel lines are cut by a transversal, we call those consecutive interior angles, or same side interior angles. And same side interior angles were always supplementary or added to be 180 degrees. Well, in a parallelogram, you have two sides that are parallel and a transversal that cuts through it. So this is the same thing. We call them consecutive angles inside the parallelogram, and they're always going to be 180 degrees. Let's use that property. As shown, part of the extending arm of a desk lamp is a parallelogram. The angles of the parallelogram change as the lamp is raised and lowered. Find the measure of angle BCD when angle ADC is 110. ADC is this angle right here. It's 110 degrees. And we're looking for BCD. Consecutive angles means one right after the next one. So angle D and angle C are consecutive. Consecutive angles always add to get 180 degrees. So by that consecutive angle theorem, we know that if we add ADC and BCD, we would get 180. If we add this angle D plus this angle C, we get 180. If one is 180, or together they're the 180, and I take away 110, that's going to leave me with 70. Another way you might look at this is to make an equation. So right here, where it says the measure of angle ADC, which is this guy, plus BCD, which is this guy, is 180. Well, I'm going to put shorthand here. So I'm going to say angle D plus angle C is 180. ADC, which is that D angle, is 110. We don't know this angle C, so let's put X in for that. That's our unknown. This is why they're subtracting 180. Then you can just simply solve for your unknown, which is the measure of angle C, or BCD, by subtracting 110 from both sides of this equation and getting 70. Another property of parallelograms is that if a quadrilateral is a parallelogram, then the diagonals will bisect each other. Let's take a moment to review all those properties. So in a parallelogram, you're going to find that opposite sides are equal to each other. So if I consider this parallelogram, then the bottom and the top are the same length, and the left side and the right side are the same length. Another property we talked about is that opposite angles have to be congruent to each other. Remember, that means exactly the same. And I can change the shape, and no matter how I change it, those opposite angles will be the same measure, as long as it's a parallelogram. What we just talked about is diagonals of a parallelogram. So if I draw one diagonal and the second diagonal, so here I've got both diagonals drawn. If I flip the length of that red one down, it will be exactly the same on each side. This is what bisects means, that it's going to cut in half. I can do the same thing for the blue one where I flip it over, and now I know bisects means cut in half. If I draw the diagonals of any parallelogram, they're always going to cut each other in half. Let's use that property. Find the value of each variable. So if I'm looking at this, I know that these diagonals bisect each other at that intersection point. So 16 has to be the same length as 4m. And I know that 9 minus n has to be the same length as 2n, right? So this is what it means to bisect, that these two will be equal and these two will be equal. Okay, so we're going to use the fact that the diagonals of parallelograms bisect each other. So let's solve for m. Because they bisect each other, that means the two pieces are equal to each other. So 4m has to be 16. So that tells me m is 4, because 4 times 4 is 16. And we can use that exact same method to solve for n. So that tells me that 2n has to be equal to n minus 9. These two pieces have to be the same length. Add n to both sides to get variables only to one side of the equal sign. And we get 3n is equal to 9. Therefore, n has to be 3 because 3 times 3 is 9. Let's look at what happens when we take a parallelogram and graph it on the coordinate plane. The diagonals of parallelogram LMNO intersect at point P. What are the coordinates of point P? We begin with the fact that the diagonals in a parallelogram bisect each other. Therefore, OP has to be equal to PM. OP has to be equal to PM. If that's true, that means point P has to be the midpoint of the line segment OM. It has to be the middle. Okay, do you remember the formula for midpoint? We're going to need that. Point O is at the origin, 0, 0. Point M is at the point 7, 4. To find the midpoint, we add the x's, divide by 2, add the y's, and divide by 2. Your x's are 0 and 7. Your y's are 0 and 4. So we'll just plug that in, giving us the midpoint as 7 halves and 4 halves, which simplifies to 7 halves and 2. I don't know that I can actually move this thing. It can't. So I think what we're seeing here is that when we simplify 7 halves, it's going to stay 7 halves. But when we simplify 4 halves, it's going to become 2. That means A is our answer. In parallelogram ABCD, AB is 4 inches and BC is 12 inches. What is the perimeter in inches of ABCD? First thing we need to remember is it's asking us for perimeter. What is perimeter? Well, in this case, perimeter refers to the total length of the sides or edges of a polygon. Well, what polygon are we talking about? We're talking about a parallelogram ABCD. So let's make a sketch. Here's a parallelogram. Let's label it A, B, C, D. Now we're told in the prompt that AB is 4 inches. So let's go ahead and label AB in our diagram. And we're told that BC is 12 inches. So let's go ahead and label BC in our diagram. We've now used all the information in our prompt. So what next? Well, we're still trying to find the perimeter. Remember, the perimeter refers to the total length of the sides or edges of the polygon, of all the sides and edges. Right now, I've only labeled 2 edges of my polygon, but I have some information that will help me. I know that opposite sides in a parallelogram are equal, so I can label CD as 4. And I can label AD as 12. And now I can find the perimeter because I know all 4 edges. The perimeter is 4 plus 12 plus 4 plus 12, which is 32 inches. Time for you to go practice. After you practice, there's an assignment that follows this lesson. I hope this helped.